A morally courageous society, the only guaranteed way to build a better tomorrow. Before I get into how we can build a morally courageous society, there's one question that I must answer first. What is moral courage? Ted Thomas says that moral courage is when one goes against the grain and does what is right for both themselves and others in line with their moral conscience. Ted Thomas believes that moral courage is a necessary attribute for those that want to change the world, because the world yields most painfully to change. Hildegard Vasquez, founder of the Hache Uve architectural firm, reiterates upon this and says that moral courage is when one's mind is aligned with their heart. Nian Hong, researcher at Shenzhen University and published in BMC Nursing Journal, says that moral courage has a direct link to how just someone is, how caring they are, and how brave they are as well. So this leads to the question, if moral courage is such a great attribute, is it something that we need in our leaders? Yes, we need to have leaders with moral courage because it's beneficial to both the leader and society as a whole. Through modern research that examines the relationship between leaders and their ability to influence others, as well as historical examples, it is evident that through a morally courageous leader, we can build a morally courageous society. Leaders have an influence on people. This is validated by Sean T. Hanna, Tylee Wilson Chair at the Business University of Wake Forest. She says that a morally courageous leader is an antecedent to a morally courageous society. This is particularly prudent when put in conjunction with Michelle Harbour, who was published in the Journal of Business Ethics, who says that when an actor in a managerial setting shows moral courage, their employees are able to be more morally courageous themselves. It is evident through the perspectives of both Sean T. Hanna and Michelle Harbour that leaders are able to influence others to be morally courageous. Although the research of Sean T. Hanna and Michelle Harbour both prove that theoretically moral courage within a leadership position is able to make others morally courageous, is there any example of this happening in history? One great example of this is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his inaugural address, has a famous quote of saying, "There's nothing to fear but fear itself." This was him showing his moral courage to all of America, because despite spearheading America in a travesty like the Great Depression, he showed his courage and made America courageous itself. This is validated by Ebert D. Thomas, who was chairman of education on the Senate during Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency. Thomas says that Franklin D. Roosevelt served the country not by ruling, but inspiring. Franklin D. Roosevelt encouraged others to do what is right for themselves and shoulder the responsibilities that come with it. This aligns perfectly with Ted Thomas's definition of moral courage, which is going against the grain and doing what's right for yourself and others, despite potential painful personal consequences. It is clear that leaders can promote moral courage and make society more morally courageous. But what happens when we have no say on our leaders? What happens if we cannot choose our leaders and make sure that they're morally courageous? Ted Thomas has an excellent example of this. Ted Thomas goes into how in the military you're expected to follow orders despite if you do not agree with them personally. Although this is true, and is true for many situations, like school, work, and even the military, where you don't have a say on who your leader is and are able to choose if they are morally courageous, it is important to utilize the times when you do have a say and elect a morally courageous leader in order to make a morally courageous society. Through the evidence provided by Ted Thomas and Shanti Hanna, as well as the historical examples of Franklin D. Roosevelt, it is evident that we can create a morally courageous society if we choose a morally courageous leader. Although we do not have the say on who is morally courageous in some settings, it is important to note that when we do, we're able to change the world. It is your duty as a democratic citizen to elect morally courageous leaders.
Okay.
It's terrible.
My first question for you is, how did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
My research question evolved a ton over the research process. Initially, I wanted to see how moral courage affected entrepreneurs and their success, but there just wasn't a lot of research around that. But when I was looking at that, I found Michelle Harber's paper on managerial courage, which is basically moral courage when you look at the definitions. And through that, I was like, I can make this about leadership instead of entrepreneurship.
Okay, good. And then the final question I have for you is, how was your conclusion in conversation with the body of literature or other research sources you examined?
So my conclusion aligns pretty much perfectly with Shanti Hanna's paper, but there is some differences because she didn't go far as saying that we need to elect morally courageous leaders. She just said that morally courageous leaders have the ability to impact society as a whole. Whereas I'm more pointing towards that we need a morally courageous leader in order to make that impact.